Good afternoon, everyone. This is Back Garden Reads, and today we're going to review the book Writing Fantasy and Science Fiction: How to Create Out-of-This-World Novels and Short Stories by Orson Scott Card, Philip Athens, Jay Lake, and several other individuals of Writer's Dice. Now, this is a non-fiction book, as you can probably tell, because it's a how-to write or writing references, it says here. It's a nice enough cover, a bit imaginative, and I know that some might have like here Orson Scott Card, and he is unfortunately a bit of a contentious writer. However, I would say that this book is he doesn't have any of that sort of thoughts of view in his section of the book. Well, it's the whole separating the work from the author, right? The death of the author. That's not what this is about. To start off, there are 4 main sections. The first section, part 1, How to Write Science Fiction and Fantasy, is written by Orson Scott Card. That has an introduction and 4 chapters within his section, totaling to about just over 100 pages. Part 2 is The State of the Genre, Fantasy and Science Fiction in the 21st Century by Philip Athens. That's about 20 pages. Part 3, The World of Steampunk by Jay Lake. That is roughly 25 pages. And then the rest is just reference material. Realistically, of this whole book, only this percent, like this much, is of reference. About 2 times the size at most. To review the first part of Orson Scott Card, it's mostly, a lot of it's advice on how to build stories, some of his experience, and he talks about some other books, some other stories, and so on. So he talks all sorts of things that could be very useful for writing in general. Many times, and just on that bit alone, as an experience, is pretty useful. However, I don't think you should dogmatically follow what he says. Generally, if you're going to take his advice, you apply some of it, and you take and practice it. You take some bits of that, internalize the bits that work well for you, and then take from other bits of advice and other on writing or whatever, and then you get it from there. That's generally how it should be done if you want to kind of get some writing. But otherwise, and he's well known for as a plotter or an architect rather than a pantser or a garden kind of writer. As in, he kind of meticulously plans a lot of things beforehand before he starts writing the actual story down. And again, that might not work for most people. I mean, look at George R. R. Martin. He is notorious for being a gardener, and I mean notorious because it's taken 13 years for us to finally hear that it's done, right? Though I don't think it's actually done. That might be incorrect there. Needless to say, George R. R. Martin has a lot of success in his stories, and Orson Scott Card also has a lot of success in his stories. It's just the construction is different. If you were to take it as just that section, you would be doing yourself a little bit of a disservice, because there's far more to learn, because you would need a lot to try a lot of different routines, writing advice, and so on, and then see what fits for you. Now, for part 2 of the book with Philip Athens, which is The State of the Genre in the 21st Century, it's not really that. Probably read this in a little bit of outside, and you can probably understand. This is unfortunately a thing of 2013 at best, and it doesn't take. And generally, I think this should be maybe rewritten or taken out or whatever, because it doesn't quite apply to the current year of 2024, for the reason that it's 11 years difference. A lot can happen in 11 years. Like, one bit here is he's talking about the success of Game of Thrones, and we all know that but in like 2019, was it, the absolute disaster of season 8 Game of Thrones, and that really just soured the entire series for many people. And this is also another problem, in that George R.R. Martin had released his book, maybe I think it was A Feast for Crows or something like that, only 2 years before the original publishing of this book. On that alone, it can be like a bit dubious. He talks about games and other things, Harry Potter and Beyond, the young reader fantasy explosion, the rise of media tie-in, the urban fantasy wave, ebook independence, enter the blogosphere, the new literati, onward and upward. It's really it's a report that is about 10 years old at this point, no, 11 years old at this point, and some of it is pretty interesting. However, it's something to kind of skim through. And again, part 3, The World of Steampunk, is by Jake Lake. He talks about steampunk and cyberpunk and several other things, origins and the growth of it, of the genre, the elements, characters, plots. Some of it's a bit interesting, but unless you're interested in steampunk, it's kind of just a skim through. I'm not really interested in it myself. Steampunk settings, steam technologies, pulling it all tropes, variations, directions, reactions to steampunk, and recommended reading. That bit of a section is, again, a little bit of a skim through. So if it was just that bit, it's this kind of disappointing 150-page book. And even then, what's actually kind of useful, which would be more useful anyway, would be these 100 pages or so. And even then, it's writing advice that might not apply to you. And so, if it is just for this, it's a great way to understand a little bit about how to write a story, world, and all this kind of critical thinking. He talks about like sci-fi, fantasy, the believability, that the differences between some audiences versus others, and that's pretty interesting. The reports are kind of again, to skim through, but really the main bulk that it will be more useful as a reference, as it is a writing reference book, is this bit here, part 4, the Writer's Complete Fantasy Reference, which is chapters by all sorts of writers. The first chapter is Traditional Fantasy Cultures, where it's talking about feudalism, manorialism, Christianity, the social order, where there's like titles, countries, ecclesiastic titles, again, knighthood, political entities, peripheral cultures, terms, and then chapter 2 is world cultures, like continents by Africa, Europe, the Americas, Asia, just generally all of that. There's like science, economy, religion, government, military, I may have repeated that, and oceanic. That can be a bit interesting if you want a little bit of reference there. And there's because each one is a little bit different, and you can kind of understand it a little bit, and you can use it as a jumping off point in deeper research into a culture, and then use that as further reference for your writing or your creative projects. Then chapter 3 is magic. It talks about it in history, in the historical context, The things like mana, force, two worlds, principles of magic, other things with that, what magic does. This is like, if you've ever heard of that, like magic systems, which in all personality I think it's one of the worst things to. Well, it's a great idea and concept. Unfortunately, I think it's sort of gone out of control, and people are now obsessed with the wrong thing. Where it's magic should be just a means of which to tell the story, or just a tool within the story of the self itself, rather than this whole like, oh, is it cooler than anything that Brandon Sanderson makes or whatever. Yeah, this one is like secret societies. There's divination, building your own magical worlds. The interesting part is the building your own magical world, because it does give you a lot of questions of which to think about when you're making a sort of magic in the world, in your sort of fantasy world, or I guess even science fiction, because you've probably heard it before. Like, there's like the difference between magic and science is generally understanding of that there's rites, written stars, astrology, but it's, well, astrology is not like the star signs, but more of a, but it had other meanings to it other than just the whole romantic shit. Witchcraft and pagan paths, that's chapter 4, so this is kind of alternative magics and spiritualities of there's some, it goes in a little bit of like traditions, pagans, neo-pagans, a little bit about their history, and yeah. Then there's chapter 5, commerce, trade, and law of contemporary fantasy, which is another interesting thing, because another bit of reference, because there's a lot of, because let's be real, most people just draw from it's like a copy of a copy of a copy, to a point where you don't even remember what the original idea was. And so this kind of gives a little bit of a jumping off point and understanding, oh, okay, so this was an actual thing, or these were actual kind of people in this sort of society. Sections them out. Part of it is like the classes of like the lower class, the middle class, and the upper class, which again, not many people understood that in the Middle Ages there was a middle class. And in many cases, the people who had the most freedom to do things in life were the middle class, generally like today. Because let's be real, with the upper class generally had to have responsibility. You had responsibility like baked into your DNA from the moment you were born, but that wasn't exactly the best. It was still better than being a peasant in some ways, and in some ways being a peasant was better than being a noble. So like the middle class was generally a much more desired place than otherwise. Then it goes into these punishments: amputation, banishment, beheading. It goes through quite a few pages of just punishments, which is pretty interesting. And some of these are quite curious indeed. Like this iron boot, fit to cover either the leg and foot, or just the foot. It allowed wood or wedges to be hammered into specific places of the feet of those being questioned. It was a favorite device for inquisition. Trade and barter, and it goes into that very briefly. Then it goes to chapter 6, where it's like fantasy races, kind of talking about all these sorts of things of like similarities, population, procreation, reason, culture. Physical similarity is obvious. Population is a more interesting thing on it. You get some stories like in The Witcher, where elves and dwarves are kind of dwindling because all the young are dying off in being so reckless and joining the squirtel, or the squirrels. They're just getting themselves killed and offed and just dead, causing this slow extinction over time. thinking of the immediate now instead of the actual future, which is a very sad thing, but it makes sense. Procreation, like how they have like children or other younger of their species. Reasoning is like their intelligence, rationality, thoughts, so on, so on. More than just animals. Culture, that's kind of self-explanatory, really. The next shows elves, no, dwarves, elves, fairies, giants, goblins and orcs, halflings and hybrids, merfolk, trolls, minor races, non-Western races. I'd say that's actually a bit more of an interesting point, is the non-Western ones, because there's this one called Hune, which is a Hawaiian race of little people. Oh, it's called Manahune. Manahune. Tipua. And unfortunately, there's not that little section is not really big, but I suppose there's not really that much difference between them. And then the interesting ones is like created races, gives you a little bit of interesting ideas and all that. And there's individualization and characterization, meaning that even if there is a specific trait among a certain group of creatures or a race or whatever, there would still be people that would be outside of that norm. Think of that, let's say, like all elves are these kind of slight and beautiful and slender, long-haired, hairless, androgynous people, right? You could say that. And that extends to the men, though. And there's just a little bit of difference between men and male and female elves. Like, you could say that there's one in which, like, one of those men elves are actually really goes outside the norm and looks like Schwarzenegger, or like a bodybuilder, and he's like this hairy, buff, mega guy, and all that, and that would be pretty interesting. But that can go outside that, or it can be the individual personalities themselves. Then there's Chapter 7, Creatures of Myth and Legends. There's an alphabetical listing of creatures: Krakens, Kappa, Jersey Devil, Manticore, Naga, Puka or Pucka? Pucka. Ruck, Sasquatch, Tengu, Thunderbird, Yeti. That's just a quick list of them, and it's kind of well, you can kind of find interesting ideas from that. Chapter 8 is dress and costume, color, materials. Talks about how they were viewed, if they were interesting, or like what it represented. Colors the same, like your status and all that. Then there's typical women's clothing, typical men's clothing, shoes, children's clothing, clergy, chastity belts. This is again a medieval European sort of reference rather than a world reference, so you could find some interest in there if you were building it from the ground up. Chapter 9, arms, armor, and armies, so that's like weapons, terms, armor, armies, like green troops, veteran troops, regular troops, quality of troops, elites, heroes, infantry, heavy infantry, light infantry, so on. Soldier terms, ranks and... wait, did I say that? Soldier terms, that includes ranks and other things. Beasts of war, so animal... And that's another thing that I find would be pretty interesting to do, though, let's be real, it would be kind of disappointing, where there was a long period of time where animals have been in use in warfare for far longer than most people realize. Like dogs and horses are horses are definitely the most well-known one. Dogs, and you go, well, that actually does make sense. You would, considering that they can be trained and used in combat and hunting and all that, it would make sense to have dogs as war animals. Then there's elephants, and then it's other like birds and monitor lizards, lions, and so on, so on, so on. It gives you it can give you like that little bit about beasts of war can give you a bit of interesting food for thought when you're coming up with a sort of war system or a war or faction or whatever in your writing. Then there's Anatomy of a Castle, kind of explains the castle construction, terms, castle life, siege, names, and other things like that. And that's where it ends at the index. I will be mostly using this as a writing reference, most likely in the future. I don't think, while there is a bit of good advice from Orson Scott Card, it can be a little bit situational, and again, depending on who you are and how you write, more useful some than others. The other two are a bit like report or essays, which are, can be a bit useful, but situational at best, and kind of a quick skim through at worst. Most of it is that reference, and you can use that reference as a jumping off point, as I said again, into something more useful. It does, however, again, in the European context. Otherwise, this is just a very good standing off point for reference material. So, in the context of writing, if you wanted to write, I would say that this is a very good book. Otherwise, there's not much other reason why you would have it. If you were just a person who had no interest in writing or making a story, constructing a story, or whatever, this would be kind of useless to you. If you wanted to write, this is a pretty good jumping off point. But it's not good for everything. You will inevitably have to go to other things. And I know I'm repeating that, but it's generally important. But otherwise, it's a very sturdy book and situationally useful. But otherwise, it's really well made. And yeah, that's my review.